Bessent is also sounding the alarm on what he calls an impending economic calamity. He is urging lawmakers to extend key provisions of the Trump tax cuts and Jobs Act. The stakes, of course, couldn't be higher. Millions of jobs, billions in lost wages could be lost if the tax cuts expire in December. And Republicans are mobilizing. Speaking at the GOP retreat in Florida, President Trump doubled down on his message: cut taxes for the American people. He even floated the idea of abolishing the federal income tax altogether.
You know, the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States. The income tax came in 1913. As I said in my speech last week, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens.
The president says that he plans to impose tariffs on a list of imports: steel, aluminum, copper, computer chips, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, all to boost domestic production. This is a very aggressive economic agenda, but it's also really exciting also. Let's just keep with the tariffs for a moment, since that's where we ended. This is a strategy, Brian, that he tried previously. They weren't able to see it through in the last administration. It's one that takes time. He's going back to do it again.
Well, loves tariffs. Tariffs, I think, is his favorite word in the dictionary, he said. Not surprising that he's talking about doing a universal tariff. But I love Kevin Hassett. I think he's my favorite economic guy in the administration, the happy warrior. And he makes such a good point. He says, when these guys talk about tariffs, they ignore all the other policies that we want to do, just like they did in the first Trump term. And if you think back to that term, we got some tariffs, but we got all sorts of supply-side pro-growth policies. And that's exactly what the president is talking about now. I mean, folks, he just said, let's eliminate the income tax. Now, I don't know if that's going to get done, but the fact that he's even talking that way tells me this is a guy who does not want to punish work, and that's the biggest thing for
Dagan,
me.
what about the federal freeze? That's also huge news today, and Schumer pushing back.
It is big news, and particularly digging into the grant issue. But to stay on the tariff thing, Kenny, so let's connect all the big players in this and what they're saying. Kevin Hassett on Kudlow yesterday said tariffs are not just a weapon, but part of a supply-side strategy as part of a tax bill. And Larry Kudlow himself has talked about, let's think about a 10% across-the-board tariff. We have $5 trillion in imports. And so you're talking about $500 billion to finance tax cuts here. So you are taxing foreign firms, your foreign manufacturers, and then giving individuals, you, and corporations here a tax cut potentially. And then there's the Financial Times article about Scott Bessent saying something that Scott Bessent is pushing for new universal tariffs on U.S. imports starting at 2.5%. This is taking shape. The biggest problem is the Republicans in the House. They control the purse strings. They will be writing this tax reform bill, and there are 48 of them who didn't show up at Doral. What in the hell is wrong with y'all?
Well, speaking of taxes, the agenda is very aggressive. He's already talking about bringing the corporate tax rate down, Taylor, not taxing Social Security, overtime, and tips. He wants to extend the 2017 tax cuts, but the CBO says if you do that, it's going to add $4 trillion over a decade to the deficit. So that's a problem. He says it might be offset by the tariffs. What do you think?
You know me. If I'm looking at the bond market, all I can think about is the debt and the deficit and how we tackle this. So the bond vigilantes don't come out and scream at us. So I love that you brought up the deficit. But I think, Jackie, as we've been talking about on this show, those tax cuts have to be #1 priority because that was the mandate from the voters. So I think you have to get that done and find revenue elsewhere. Is that revenue 2.5%, as Dagan mentioned, what Scott Bessent laid out? What's interesting about that in terms of a revenue source is, to me, markets like certainty. So if you tell me 10% tariff, if I'm a company like GM, I can handle that. If you tell me that every month it's going up by 2.5%, I have a hard time planning around that because how do I figure out, do I buy the goods now? What if the tariffs go up? Is it a negotiating tool? Is it going up? And so Scott Bessent is the smartest person in the room, do not get me wrong, but some of that makes me nervous when you think about just those monthly increments.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up the market and the reaction to it, Kenny. That's where I want to bring you in. Obviously, we had a rough day yesterday. We're dealing with that AI story. That's part of the issue. But the markets have been up since Trump has come into office. Even though we started the year on a little bit of a down note, tells me that investors are very optimistic about this.
I think they're very optimistic, and I hear it when I'm talking to people. I'm very optimistic about what the future holds and what all these policy holds. And actually, this whole idea about eliminating the income tax or redefining it and coming in with, kind of a 10% tariff tax and giving an income tax break to Americans encourages them to work more, in my opinion, encourages them then to spend more, in my opinion. So then you end up having a stronger and better economy. I think the market likes it. I think it's clear. I think yesterday's action in the market was a separate issue.
Yeah.
Although we could say that the market needs to pull back a little bit because maybe it's a little bit stretched, and that's fine. But yesterday's action, I think, was completely a whole different issue.
Allow me to apologize for Woodrow Wilson, fellow Virginian, who was the president who implemented the income tax.
Apology accepted,
We
Dagan.
fully disavow him for many reasons. Let's bring in Arthur Rosenberg. He is an aviation attorney. He's a former pilot. Arthur, thank you so much for being here. One thing that listening to Secretary Duffy when he was with Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States there, he said that we want to determine what caused this as quickly as possible. Given the conditions of last night, where it was clear skies and you already have the audio coming out of air traffic control, how quickly can the National Traffic Transportation Safety Board determine the cause of this catastrophic accident?
Yeah, so there's two ways to look at that. First, our sympathies go out to the families of the victims and the victims on both the American Airlines flight and on the military Black Hawk helicopter. So the bottom line here is the NTSB has certain timeline protocols. They have to put out an initial statement within 30 days. The final report can take 1 or 2 years. But as a practical matter, from what I've seen and available information, I don't think it would be terribly difficult to determine what the probable cause of this horrible disaster was in relative short order.
Okay. And the president said he would be transparent with us as soon as they have more information, Arthur. But there's two things happening simultaneous here. So one of them is investigating what the actual cause was of the accident. But at the second thing is really sort of reshaping the FAA. And President Trump talked about how in his first term, he reversed Obama policies, DEI policies, and then, of course, President Biden came in, reversed those again. He wanted to revert back to looser restrictions that allowed more people who might not have necessarily been qualified to hold those positions within the FAA. How long does it take for an administration that is only 10 days old to reshape, weed out what's not working, and make Americans feel safe in the air again?
Okay, so let's answer this two ways. Let's deal with the objective facts, and then there's the political determinations. It's in terms of what happened here. From my point of view, this was an air traffic control foul-up. They detoured the plane from its initial runway 1 at Reagan National to runway 33 in Northwest. It brought us closer to the helicopter. There must have been a breakdown in communication between the airplane and the controller and the military Black Hawk helicopter and the controller. By the way, the military controller, the military pilot is also talking to a military controller. So somehow in that litany of people involved in the sequence of events, there was a breakdown in communication. Now, assuming that this was an air traffic control foul-up, which I do believe it was, if you have a systemic problem within the air traffic control, within the FAA, from a policy determination, DEI or otherwise, we're going to let the politicians ferret that out. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. Here we have a controller who was speaking to the American Airlines flight. Apparently there was some communication to the Black Hawk pilot. Do you see the other airplane? In that moment, in my view, that was a mistake. The two planes were very close. The controller should have told the helicopter pilot, hold your position, turn left, turn right, climb, descend, basically get the hell out of the way of an American airline plane on final approach. Whether that's DEI, whether it's an overworked controller, whether something missed, something to be determined.
So I want to follow up on some of the funding that we've been talking about with the FAA. I think if anyone has been on an airplane in the last 5 years after COVID, a plane has been delayed because of staffing shortages at the FAA. I don't think anyone wants to be spending more money, right? We all love DOGE because we're focused on exactly where money needs to be going and how to use it efficiently. But is this a question about staffing shortages and funding of FAA?
Yeah, so over the last decade, the number of operations of aircraft moving every single day has absolutely skyrocketed. In my view, the number of controllers, ground and air, has not kept pace with the increased boom in traffic. We need more controllers. We need better trained controllers. The system is growing. You can't have constraints on the people who are issuing commands and controls to aircraft and at the same time have the number of operations skyrocketing. That is a formula for disaster, and unfortunately, last night we got the first inkling of what that could be. That being said, I want the flying public to know you have about a 1 in 18 million chance of, God forbid, something like this happening. Flying is safe.
You know, that the corridor that we're talking about here into DCA is one of the most congested in America, and it got busier actually because of the FAA reauthorization bill last year that allowed more flights into DCA. It's been congested for a long time, and there have been a lot of people who can handle that just fine. But do you think it's gotten to a point, especially with the FAA shortages you're talking about, that maybe we shouldn't have so much traffic coming into DCA?
Yeah, so there's a fine balance between economics and safety. The Federal Aviation Administration in our country actually has a dual role, safety and economics. They're in the business of controlling aviation, air traffic controllers, certifying airplanes, and they're also in the business of promoting aviation. Those two things clash at times, and the clash usually manifests itself in something unsafe, an accident happening, which unfortunately is what we have last night. In my view, we need a larger, more robust air traffic control center with the FAA, and we need them in other areas too, including certifying airplanes at Boeing and otherwise. There's just not enough people to go around for the growth that we've experienced in aviation over the last decade.
Arthur, before we go, there was something. This is related to something you said earlier, and I'm just going to read you. This is something that Pete Hegseth said, the defense secretary, related to the accident. He said there was some sort of an elevation issue, talking about the Black Hawk, that we have immediately begun investigating at the DOD. Is he referring to the altitude and the height at which that Black Hawk was flying, the same as that CRJ, the American Eagle flight? Is that what he's referring to? Why was that helicopter and why was that jet, why were they flying at the same elevation and the same altitude?
Okay, so this is not rocket science. When you have a commercial airline at low altitude on final approach, they have priority almost everything else that's going on in the area. Here we had a military Black Hawk helicopter conducting a training operation, basically cut off a commercial airline on final approach. They obviously were at the same altitude, where we're not aware of the altitude differences. Certainly the controllers weren't. But you always give deference to the airplane on short flying. Here, the military plane was conducting a training operation. My view is that they probably, the pilot of the Black Hawk was probably using night vision goggles. Night vision goggles are notorious for distorting perception, distances, altitudes, colors. You can see the instruments, it gives you kind of tunnel vision in front of you, but you don't have the same field of vision that you and I have when we walk around the street. Did that contribute in my view, not knowing all the facts, but I would say based on what I've seen and heard, probably yes.
Arthur, thank you so much. Arthur Rosenberg, we do know that night vision goggles were aboard the helicopter. We will wait to find out if indeed the pilot was wearing them at the time. They were flying VFR of visual flight rules, which is not instrument flight rules, so that's by sight. It was a clear night. But Arthur Rosenberg, thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, next up, the Fed is more worried about Trump tariffs than interest rates or the money supply, and they're just panicking over the Trump tariffs. So we got to talk about it. Today was Fed Day. They didn't do anything on the interest rate front, but we're going to have Dan Clifton, partner and head of policy research at Strategas Securities, John Carney, Breitbart Finance and Economics editor and co-author of the daily Breitbart Business Digest. Gentlemen, thank you. You know, Dan Clifton, reading your report today, hearkening back to 2018, the Fed may make the exact same mistakes. They're going to, I mean, and by the way, this is a Federal Reserve Board in Washington where the staff and whoever governors, what was the number? 90% or over 80% donated money to Democrats. So I just want to I want to remind people of that. Now, your point is, and I think John's going to agree, but your point is the Fed is crazy about tariffs. The economists at the Fed are going to say it's inflationary, just like they did in 2018 and 2019, and they might raise rates and really damage the Trump boom. What do you make of this, Dan Clifton?
Yeah, so let me just, as you know better than anybody because you were in the White House at that time, we did a massive pro-growth tax cut at the end of 2017. We did small tariffs on China, maybe about $50 billion of tariffs on China over the course of 2018. And the Fed just got really worried that this was inflationary, that the higher growth from the tax cut and the tariffs. And so they made a decision to keep rates high and elevated throughout all of 2018, Larry. And what they did was they cut off growth. You could see it in the yield curve flattening all throughout the year. And boom, December of 2018 comes and the S&P 500 falls 20% in the month of December. And they were then forced to cut. So they were wrong. Trump was right. And that's okay. People make mistakes. I don't get everything right. But they are literally using the same logic today to justify higher interest rates now.
Yeah.
They were all about cutting rates in September. Today, they're all about, well, the inflation is not moderating down, and we're worried about tariffs. This is three meetings in a row where they've been focused on tariffs.
John Carney, I mean, Dan makes awful good points here. By the way, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but my suspicion, let me put it to you that way, the Fed's staff, the Washington staff, and 300 or 400 economists, they think Trump, first of all, is not a good president. They're not Trumpers. They're anti-Trumpers. Second of all, they think the tariffs will be inflationary. That's one way of getting at Trump, which is what Dan is describing. Third of all, John, as you pointed out, we've discussed, the Fed thinks, strong growth is inflationary. They have this Phillips curve thing. So on all three counts, and that's what's so worrisome. And you have the Fed spokesperson, the Wall Street Journal reporter, Nick Timiraos. He's writing columns about the Fed's fear of tariffs, right? Timiraos is always a leading indicator. You look at his stories, he never seems to mention any conservatives or Republicans, just the liberals, anti-Trumpers. Anyway, what do you make of this, John? Do you see it? Are you worried about it? Or would the Fed just do what they're supposed to do, John Carney? Wait, do nothing until the Trump plan is passed and implemented.
I think they're playing a very interesting game. Because you're absolutely right. The Wall Street Journal printed Nick Timiraos' story, and it was clearly meant to say that the Fed is very worried about inflation from these tariffs. But today, in his press conference, Powell took a very different stance. He absolutely refused to hit back at the tariffs. I think that he may have gotten the message overnight that Wall Street Journal article was a mistake, that he was politicizing the Fed. And he very clearly said, I'm not going to talk about tariffs. They asked him, will you talk about DEI then? No, we wouldn't talk about that. Will you talk about deporting people? No, I won't talk about that. He actually got a little religion overnight, and he's trying to get back into the Fed's lane, which is where he should be. controlling inflation, not, talking about what the proper trade policy of the United States.
But the thing that's so amazing, look, I don't believe this tariff, whatever Jay Powell may or may not have said today, I don't think the tariff fear is over. I think that you've got a lot of economists in the board whispering in his ear. But there's nothing to report about yet. But Dan, what's so interesting, we've now, I think Colombia, the Trump threatening Colombia on accepting deported criminals back to Colombia. We didn't get the 25 or 50% tariff on Colombia because of Trump's tariff diplomacies. They didn't do it. And I think, judging from what Howard Lutnick said today in his confirmation hearings for Commerce Secretary and what the press room said, what the press secretary said yesterday, it sounds like Canada and Mexico are helping us sufficiently, U.S. government, on the border, so we won't get those 25% tariffs either. I mean, in other words, it's so interesting. The people who are crazed about tariffs don't understand Trump. They don't understand his negotiation. They don't understand tariff diplomacy. Because he's so good at it, we don't get the kind of tariff hikes that everyone's, talking about.
Well, Larry, I think you're absolutely right. And what I would say is that the threat of tariffs are not real if people just think that it's a threat. I think President Trump will use those tariffs if he's not getting what he wants, whether that's in Mexico or China or wherever it's going to be. The key issue here is that what is the plan? We may do tariffs and we may do a 15% corporate domestic rate cut at the same time. You don't know that. And does that change your equation overall? The Fed should not be in this business of trying to do that. And what they're doing is they're taking all the bad, what they see the bad, a tighter immigration and the tariffs, and they're not looking at the good, the construction of the LNG export terminals and the energy renaissance that's coming and the pro-growth tax cuts. And if you're only focused on the bad, you're going to get monetary policy wrong and you're going to make a great policy error. And that's the lesson from 2018. And unfortunately, much of the news flow from the Fed since the election has been following that path. And so the rhetoric may have changed. I think that's a good thing. But actions are going to speak louder than words.
John Carney, I got 20 seconds. I would take a 15% tariff and then put the 15% tariff proceeds into a 15% tax rate on businesses, and might even put it a 15% capital gains tax in there too. What do you think? 15, 15, 15.
Larry, we could do an even bigger tax cut than that. The corporate, if we had tariffs in place that were generating revenues, we could almost eliminate the corporate tax altogether. Can you imagine how great that would be for American businesses?
That is hot stuff.
If we brought that down. So 15% might be a good starting place, but let's go lower. Let's aim for the best, get that tax rate as far down as we can. Trump loves McKinley. He loves he loves bringing up
I got to jump.
when we were generating real revenue.
Thanks to both of you, really. Thank you. John Carney, Dan Clifton, you're both terrific. Thanks.
Look, he's keeping his promises, that's for sure. He was in Las Vegas over the weekend proposing a new plan for the nearly 90,000 IRS agents that Joe Biden hired under the last 4 years. Trump has new ideas. Watch this.
On day one, I immediately halted the hiring of any new IRS agents. They hired or tried to hire 88,000 new workers to go after you, and we're in the process of developing a plan to either terminate all of them or maybe we'll move them to the border. I think we're going to move them to the border. Well, they're allowed to carry guns. They're so strong on guns, but these people are allowed to carry guns, so we'll probably move them to the border.
Your reaction, I mean, this is incredible, sending these IRS agents to the border. What are they going to do? One of the issues here is that President Trump found out that a majority of the audits that were done, a Treasury Inspector General report found that more than 90% of the agency audits between 2019 and 2023 were taxpayers making less than $400,000 a year, Chris. I mean, the president already said he'd like to create an external revenue service to collect profits and tariff from foreign countries. His Treasury Secretary nominee, Scott Bessent, could be confirmed by the Senate as early as today. This is important. This will give the markets clarity, Chris.
It definitely gives the markets clarity because we weaponized the IRS, right? And it wasn't even against the wealthiest. It was against the middle market, which is exactly what Biden promised against. And the idea of saying we need more revenue instead of growing the economy, the idea was hire more IRS agents, turning this against our people. That's why people were so excited about President Trump saying, let's go and collect the monies owed to us by other countries. What a novel idea that is. So I think it's going to be, I think many of those people are going to be, his messages, those people are going to be looking for work, and they're going to have to develop ways to build the economy as opposed to additionally taxing our people.
Absolutely. What do you think, Cheryl?
Well, they were targeting small businesses, Maria. We've talked about this on this program. That's what they started to do. You go after the low-hanging fruit. You go after who you think won't fight back. And that is, we already knew this was happening. People under 400,000, making 400,000 and less. Again, a lot of those were small businesses, small LLCs across this country. This is the IRS. So, look, if you want to fire him as under the border, I'm going to go with fire, Maria.
Welcome back. The Senate starting to move quickly on President Trump's cabinet picks, confirming Sean Duffy as Transportation Secretary last night in a vote 77-22. More hearings happening today. RFK Jr. for HHS Secretary, Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary, and Kelly Loeffler for the head of the Small Business Administration. Tomorrow's hearings include Kash Patel for FBI Director and Tulsi Gabbard for the Director of National Intelligence. Some Republican senators reportedly want the Intelligence Committee to hold an open vote on Gabbard rather than do so behind closed doors. Joining me now is Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. He is the chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence and the author of 7 Things You Can't Say About China. Senator, great to have you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, thank you, Maria. It's good to be on with you.
Will we see the Tulsi Gabbard vote in the open, or is that happening behind closed doors?
Maria, we'll conduct the hearing for Ms. Gabbard exactly the way we did for Director Ratcliffe at the CIA. The committee rules only release the vote tallies, not the roll call itself. However, as with Mr. Ratcliffe and past nominees, as a practical matter, the vote roll call is usually known within just a few minutes as senators make statements or the media make inquiries. So you can be confident that everyone will know where everyone stands on Ms. Gabbard, as well as everywhere where they stand on every other nominee that President Trump sent to the Senate.
Mr. Chairman, how do you assess these hearings right now? I mean, I've been talking about this all morning, the fact that you're in the majority, but it seems like the Democrats keep coming up with ideas to, stall or make it longer. Like now they're trying to postpone Russ' vote as if he's controversial in any way, shape, or form because of the freeze in funding. How's it going?
Well, the Democrats are certainly good at manufacturing a lot of baseless claims and allegations. I mean, consider Ms. Gabbard. For years, they've questioned her patriotism. This is a woman who served 21 years in uniform, who's passed 5 background checks. I reviewed the latest one last week. It's clean as a whistle. So there's no end to what the Democrats will manufacture as baseless claims or procedural stalling tactics for these nominees. However, we're moving along. We're getting them confirmed. We've told the Democrats we can do this the easy way or we can do it the hard way. And the hard way means we're going to be in through nights and through weekends. The Democrats want to do that through Friday night on Pete Hegseth. That's exactly what we did. We got him confirmed late Friday night. Then they threw in the towel for the weekend. We're actually ahead of where we would have been if the Democrats had dug in their heels and made us stay in session through the weekend, overnight. So I think we're moving along with good pace. We're going to get Lee Zeldin confirmed to the EPA today. We're going to start working on Doug Burgum. And I predict before we leave for the weekend, if we leave, we'll confirm Doug Burgum to be Secretary of Interior, Chris Wright to be Secretary of Energy, and Doug Collins to be Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
That's terrific. Congrats on that. We'll be watching that. Now the work begins in terms of executing the president's agenda. What do you favor? Putting everything in one big bill? How will you execute the president's agenda, including the extension of the tax cuts?
I'm with the president on this one. I favor whatever we can get 218 votes and 51 votes in the Senate for to actually make America safer and more prosperous, to extend and enhance those tax cuts, to secure our border, to unleash American energy production, to rebuild our military. I don't think most Americans care that much about how we get it done, just as long as we get it done and make sure that America is safer and more prosperous than it was for 4 years under Joe Biden's failed presidency.
Well, I certainly want to get to rebuilding the military. I love what you all are talking about. But let's talk first on China and your book, The 7 Things You Can't Say. China is pushing back on the CIA finally admitting that COVID likely originated from that lab in Wuhan. China's foreign ministry is claiming that it is extremely unlikely that the pandemic was caused by a lab leak. All of this coming just 2 days after CIA Director John Ratcliffe was sworn in. He joined me on Sunday Morning Futures. Watch this.
I had the opportunity on my first day to make public an assessment that actually took place in the Biden administration. So it can't be accused of being political, and it does assess. The CIA has assessed that the most likely cause of this pandemic that has wrought so much devastation around the world was because of a lab-related incident in Wuhan. And so we'll continue to investigate that moving forward. But I think it was important for the American people to see an institution like the CIA get off the sidelines and be truthful about what our intelligence shows, at the same time of protecting us from adversaries like China if they caused or contributed to this.
But of course, Senator, you were the first to flag that COVID did leak from the lab, likely. You were with me in February 2020, and your work speaks for itself. Here it is.
China was lying from the beginning, and they're still lying today. This virus did not originate in the Wuhan animal market. The virus went into that food market before it came out of that food market. We also know that just a few miles away from that food market is China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that researches human infectious diseases. Now, we don't have evidence that this disease originated there, but because of China's duplicity and dishonesty from the beginning, we need to at least ask the question to see what the evidence says. And China right now is not giving any evidence on that question at all.
Senator, thank you for your leadership and your incredible work. You nailed it back then and continue to show incredible leadership. What should we understand about communist China?
Yeah, Maria, being on your show talking about this with you 5 years later is like a trip down memory lane or deja vu. Because, as you say, it was on your show that I first said where any person with common sense and 2 eyes would have concluded that this virus almost certainly came from a laboratory. I was pleased to see that CIA has now reached that same conclusion. And as Director Ratcliffe said, that happened on Joe Biden's watch. I read that report before Director Ratcliffe publicized it. It happened in the final week of the Biden administration. It cannot be accused of a politicized intelligence assessment. That's the best evidence we have. I think the question now is whether we're going to make communist China pay. I write in my new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China, that China is an evil empire, that China is waging economic world war. China is preparing for war. China has infiltrated our society and our government, and the only way to stop this is to recognize the threat. 7 Things You Can't Say About China tries to ring the alarm bell for every American about the threat that communist China poses to our way of life. There are some things we can do right away. I have legislation that I once sponsored with Secretary of State Marco Rubio that I now continue to sponsor with others like Josh Hawley that would take away China's permanent most favored nation status. We can make sure that we're building our military in a way that deters Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific. President Trump is talking about posing across-the-board sanctions on Chinese products. We need to reshore a lot of critical manufacturing and other industrial production so we're not dependent on China for critical things like rare earth elements or basic pharmaceuticals. These are all things that China has done to challenge our global primacy, and we have to recognize the threat if we're going to beat that challenge back.
Well, your book is incredibly important. Thank you for the book, because the public does need to understand the threat here. Would you support removing Chinese stocks from American exchanges, sir? I mean, look, we know that even companies that are sanctioned are still trading on U.S. exchanges, basically enabling ordinary Americans to invest in those companies and, in effect, fund the expansion of our '1 adversary.
Yeah, and Maria, oftentimes they don't meet our disclosure standards either for things like basic audit. So I've long thought this is another foolish example how our elites for 40 years have let China play by one set of rules while we play by the other set of rules. We should not allow these companies with opaque financials who are based in China to be listed in our stock exchanges, not just to fund their operations that can be used to undermine American workers and businesses or national security, but also as a real threat to fraud on American investors. It's just one more example of how China has insinuated itself into every corner of American life. Again, I lay out in 7 things you can't say about China, how they've done it in Hollywood, in the media, in universities, in Washington, D.C., at state and local governments as well. The threat is real, and it's actually more present in your daily lives than you probably realize.
Exactly. And by the way, now we're talking about the intellectual property theft, perhaps including DeepSeek, right? I mean, the whole market goes nuts over the Chinese AI program, DeepSeek, and now we're hearing, well, wait a minute, how did they get this? How did they do it? Maybe it was partly stealing intellectual property from America.
Yeah, Maria, China has a long history of that. In every FBI district around the country, there's open investigations into Chinese espionage, whether it's industrial espionage against companies or espionage against, say, our national laboratories or U.S. government-funded research at universities. This happens all the time. China brings companies into China. It forces them into joint ventures. It steals their technology, and then it kicks them out. I lay out all of these malicious practices in 7 things you can't say about China to, again, ring the alarm bell for normal Americans to realize that the threat to China is present in their everyday lives.
So why would General Milley want to tell China secrets that the U.S. was going to do before it was announced? Look, I know you have mixed feelings about this. I want to get your take on it. The Pentagon has stripped the security detail clearances for General Mark Milley after doing the same to John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. Milley, I believe it's partly because under the first Trump administration, he wanted to alert China to anything that Trump was going to do. Is that the same? Do you feel the same about the security detail here as you would for Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, who obviously have fatwas on their back? The Iranians want them dead?
Well, Maria, all these people are targeted by Iran because they carried out President Trump's policy in his first term. I understand the president has had a falling out with them and soured on them, and that's fine. But this is more about innocent Americans and the president's ability to implement his agenda going forward than it is about them or his feelings for them. So it's possible that these people could be targeted by Iranian assassins in public where innocent bystanders could be injured. This could have a chilling effect on the people around the president right now on giving him the advice that he needs and carrying out his decisions, not just against Iran, but say against China or Mexican drug cartels who are present in our streets today. It may deter some people from going to work for the administration. Some people might fear that if they go to work to crack down on Mexican drug cartels, that they could be targeted next. And I know some people have said that these individuals, could pay for their own security. They're now wealthy. That's not really an adequate answer, though, because private security contractors don't have access to law enforcement information in the intelligence community. That information has been critical, for instance, in thwarting a threat against one of them just a couple summers ago that was imminent. So I would encourage the president to revisit this. It's not about what he feels about these men or what they're doing now. It's really about his ability to implement his own agenda and ensuring that no innocent Americans are harmed as bystanders.
Understood. Fair point. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth met at the White House yesterday to discuss Trump's plans for an Iron Dome-like U.S. defense system. Trump will meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu next week at the White House, and the Senate Democrats are blocking a bill sanctioning officials from the International Criminal Court who issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. Your reaction?
Well, this is just another example of the Democrats saying one thing and doing another. They often claim that they're supporting Israel, but in the end, they block a bill while Benjamin Netanyahu is facing an illegitimate arrest warrant from this kangaroo court. But Maria, it's worse than that. This is not primarily about Israel or other allies. This is about our own troops. This kangaroo court has repeatedly investigated American troops who served overseas in the last 25 years and made threats that they might actually go forward with prosecutions and arrest warrants. So this is not primarily about protecting our friends in Israel, although it will do that. It's about protecting our own service members from this illegitimate kangaroo court. And every Democrat but John Fetterman yesterday voted to leave our troops exposed.
That's unbelievable. Real quick on this Iron Dome for America executive order. I'm very excited to hear these plans. Is this going to spawn a new effort, a massive effort to increase our innovation and armament in the military? I know you've spoken a lot about the lack of ships in the Navy, certainly relative to what China has. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what's needed. And you're talking about $120 billion for defense in the reconciliation package.
Yeah, Maria, like Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, and I have long advocated for a robust and effective missile defense over our North American homeland. We don't want to be deterred by China and Russia's growing missile forces from defending our own interests around the world, from standing up from Chinese aggression, whether it's military aggression or economic aggression. Of course, we should have a strong missile defense to protect Americans from the growing threat of China and Russia and even other nations like North Korea pose to our homeland.
All right, Senator, thanks very much. I hope I didn't talk you out there. Please have some hot tea there. I can hear your voice is going. Thank you for being here, sir. And thank you for your leadership.
Brian, we got an exclusive look inside of this plane and how this operation works. You have Border Patrol working with the military, showing this really strong show of force.
Any regrets coming into the United States illegally?
Shackled one by one, Fox gets an exclusive look as dozens of illegal migrants are escorted onto the C-17 military plane headed back to Ecuador.
Don't come to the United States illegally. If you do come to the United States illegally, you will be removed.
43 females and 37 males packed onto the plane, including some family units. These are illegal migrants from Ecuador who broke the law when they crossed illegally into the U.S. Border Patrol says they were already in custody, either found between ports of entry checkpoints, smuggling operations, or stash houses. While expedited removals aren't new, using military aircraft is.
This is the second largest plane the Air Force has. It's going to fit 80 of these illegal migrants. Border Patrol says the message is if you come into the United States illegally, you will be sent back to your home country.
It's all part of President Trump's plan to utilize military resources and crack down on illegal immigration.
To be able to have people back in their home countries within 7 hours, a range of a plane like this, 2,700 miles, that puts you pretty much anywhere in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and anywhere in between.
And the flight crew told me that they were the same crew that brought that group of illegal migrants to Colombia over the weekend. The government turned them away until President Trump stepped in, threatened tariffs, and you know what happens next. The president of Colombia quickly backed down. They were hoping that this sends a strong message to all other countries to cooperate with these removal flights and accept its citizens, or that will happen. Brian.
I think it did. Brooke Taylor, great report. Thanks for that.
So while Costco dies on the DEI hill, other companies are waking up to the reality of everything. DEI is bad for business. After years of being pushed by activist groups, more companies are getting behind this merit-based approach. But will it be missed? Most experts say no. Brett Stevens, writing for the New York Times, quote, the long overdue ban on DEI is at least a solid cause for hope. All right, so it was a 2023 Supreme Court ruling that banned affirmative action for college admissions. They basically said race-based affirmative action in college admissions violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That is one, I think, that they're referencing there, the AGs, when they talk about DEI. And basically, affirmative action was implemented to give certain groups advantages, but they also realized there was a time limit, an expiration on that. Once they got those advantages, you wouldn't need it anymore. Sandra Day O'Connor actually said that in an old opinion. And so here we are in 2025, and companies are still using these practices. I realize they're not schools, and it's a little different and nuanced. But having said that, why should we be giving people an unfair advantage? Why can't we go back to, you're the best person, you get the job?
You know what I find so fascinating is if you just hire on merit, because I have a huge base of companies to look at that we're investors in, over 50 of them. You just hire on merit, as we do, you get tremendous diversity, because we don't care if you're gay or transvestite or you have tattoos or fish hooks in your eyelids. We couldn't give a damn. Can you do the job? Can you execute on the mandate? Those are the people we advance. If you can do it, I don't care what planet you came from. You got a job. And that actually solves this whole problem. And we should have never got ourselves in this place. Regarding Costco, I'm a shareholder. They're nuts if they think I want them fighting the federal government on policy. I don't care who took that poll when. There's no way you'd get that result today. You don't fight the attorney general in multiple states. You got to be out of your mind.
Yeah.
That's bad for business. So chop, chop, guys. Figure this out. You're breaking the law. Get compliant. I mean, hire for merit and advance people that deserve it, and you will find every race, color, gender, everybody will come to the fore.
And sometimes companies make mistakes, Taylor. We've talked about it over and over again. The wall of companies over there that we just showed that have gone this direction, but then they have quickly come back and said, you know what, we're not doing this anymore for various reasons. And these are massive companies, American, McDonald's, John Deere, I could go on and on and on. Yet Costco is still just ripping.
I love that we mentioned Target because that was the big one last week when the headlines came in and we were like, oh my gosh, if Target's turning around, you know that it is a brave new world here. And I like that Kevin talked about how he's a shareholder in Costco because I think you and I think similarly on this story. We are capitalists. I have a right to invest in Costco or not invest in Costco based on what they are doing. And I think, Kevin, you alluded to that. Costco, though, for its point, has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders to do what is best for the company. Now, in this instance, they have said they think this is best for the company. But then in reaction, as the capital markets, we get to decide if I'm a shareholder or if I sell. And if I'm going to buy that toilet paper, whatever, we can get in bulk at Costco or not. And the capital markets, as we learned with Target and everyone else, eventually it rights itself.
Yeah. Dagan, I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm just going to let you go.
How is discriminating based on race or, again, whatever box someone checks, how is discrimination to achieve racial balance good for business?
Right.
What is their slogan going to be? Down with merit? Is that how they're going to try and bring people in the door? And Lauren was talking about people are going to picket for better pay and better work hours. This company has a lot bigger problems than trying to keep pushing an agenda, an ideological agenda that does not breed social cohesion and hurts unity among the workforce.
Right.
What do you think about the strikes, Brian? I thought of you when I read that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue for Costco, as big of an issue as the issue we're talking about here with DEI. But here's the difference with Costco and Target, okay? And maybe tell me if I'm wrong, but when Target was doing this stuff, you knew it because they were pushing it right in your face, right in the front of the store. Is Costco doing that with their products? Have they done that with their products? I'm not aware of it. In other words, the attorneys general are saying to Costco, either drop it or tell us what you're doing, okay? What if Costco, but let me ask this, what if Costco is calling it DEI, but it's actually not stuff that's against the law? What if they're using that brand? Is that okay? Can they do that?
I would have to read the lawsuit, which I didn't coming into this segment, but I'm guessing this isn't a Target situation where they put merchandise in front of people that people found offensive. But to Dagan's point, that it's a check the box kind of thing when you're hiring or you're thinking about how you want your company to look.
Well, that's what the attorney generals want them to answer.
Right.
Are you doing this when you hire people? If the answer is yes, then, Kevin, they're going to be in your hot water. They're going to be in legal trouble. But I think it's good for the attorneys general to ask these guys, tell us what you mean, because we actually need to define what companies are doing. And it might be enlightening to know what Costco's doing or not doing.
Yeah, but they're still getting sued, and I don't like it.
Well, I wouldn't either.
It's that simple. And so at the end of the day, when you piss off the federal government, it costs shareholders money. And that's exactly what's happened here. Go fix.
I gotta go.
I tell the executives.
I'm in trouble.